And hey, all early joiners. Thanks for hanging out with us for a minute as we accidentally started our webinar early. I'm Will Pringle. I head up our sales engineering efforts at Preset. I know we'll give it a few more minutes for those to join, but Evan, also want to pass it off to you for some intros.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Evan Rusakis. I work with Preset and I'm part of the Apache Superset community as a PMC member. And I've probably talked to many of you on Slack and other fora, and very happy that Will is here to talk about embedded, which is one of the big use cases that comes up over and over again in the community and with our Preset customers. Just wanted to go ahead and give people a couple of ways to communicate with us before we get into the demo itself. And let's see, there's a few things really. One is you should all be on Superset Slack by now if you're not already. And if you aren't a member, here is the link with which you can join. And then once you're in there, you'll find there's actually two channels you can communicate with us in about embedded. There is a general embedded channel, just #embedded. But then just for today, I started a Slack channel on there as well that's meetup-embedded. We're going to try starting a new Slack channel for each one of these meetups that we do. So that's a good place to ask questions that are specific to this gathering and this presentation. And if anybody watching the recording of this later wants to follow up with questions they didn't get to ask during the live presentation, that's the place. And I'm going to hit my do not disturb button. Then also, yeah, sorry, I got distracted there. I think that's the main thing, is ask questions on Slack. But the other thing I was going to say is don't ask questions on chat if you can help it. There is a Q&A tab. Go ahead and drop your questions in there, and that's a much more manageable way to handle these things. So I would appreciate it if you put your questions in there. And I will hand it over to Will, if you'd like to. I guess you already did introduce yourself, but yeah, take it away and thank you.
Yep. And again, for those who just joined, I head up pre-sales here at Preset. So happy to further discuss these in later conversations as well. As Evan mentioned, I will keep an eye on that Q&A, so please drop questions in there. In terms of our agenda, we'll talk a little bit about best practices around preparing your data for embedding dashboards, then going into enabling embedding, walking through a little demo of how we would make some more specific data for our customers accessible in an external application, and then talking through some configuration options, styling, best practices, etc. And we'll obviously leave some time open for questions. And I see we have some questions rolling in already. A lot of the early part of this is going to be focused on specifically enabling with Preset. That is, given that Preset's API and features make this ready to go out of the box. We certainly can take some of those questions related to Superset deployment more specifically into the Slack thread later on. But a lot of what we talk about with styling, the best practices here, are going to be the same whether we're working with Preset or Superset here. And really at the core of that is focusing on the dataset centric approach. So while there's not going to be a limit to how many dashboards we can embed, how many data sets those dashboards are built off of, we're going to make our lives a lot easier if we can simplify this down to some common data sets that contain all of the different iterations of data that we'd be looking to embed. So for example, if we were looking at a simple customers table where we want to embed within our application just a view of customer A's data, the more we can get that into common data sets where we can very easily limit what rows of data our customers would have access to, the much easier time we're going to have implementing embedded dashboards into our application, both through the dashboard building process, where we can really build just one templated dashboard, but also on the ease of use of how we'll authenticate these users to view these dashboards, which we'll touch on in a minute here. But where we see embedded go really smooth is when we've done this data prep prior to starting to build our dashboards, so that we can make this much easier to work with going forward. And we'll drop this in the chat, but if you don't have access to Embedded in Preset, you can always reach out to us through this URL. And that will allow us to turn it on for your preset instance. This is behind a feature flag for those running Superset, so we enable that feature flag for our preset customers there. So you'd be able to follow along the steps that we'll walk through here in a moment. And the first thing we'll do is build, obviously, a dashboard that we want to embed. So if we get a dashboard to a point where we're ready to embed it, all of the same styling, look, and feel that we see within preset here will ultimately be rendered into our application. So any edits that we want to make, whether that be for the properties of this dashboard, such as the color scheme, or if we want to add CSS styling to make this look and feel match our application even more, all of this will be passed through when we embed this into our application. So the first step is really getting that dashboard to the point where you feel comfortable embedding it. For now, we'll leave those changes as we already have this pretty well set. And then provided that that feature flag has been turned on in your instance, you'll see this embed dashboard option under the dashboard menu. And first that will show up as non-activated. So the first thing we would do is enable embedding. And this is going to give us all the relevant parameters that we'll use in a minute to create guest users who have access to this dashboard. This also is the point where we can whitelist only certain domains where this dashboard will be able to render. So if we want to make sure that it will only be, listed at superset.example.com, we have that ability to limit it for additional security here. And the next step is we're going to use those relevant parameters to make an API call. So we're going to want to note the workspace ID, team ID, domain, and dashboard ID. And we don't have to worry about that too much, as we can always come back and see those parameters. But we will use those as we make an API call here in a moment to generate a guest token that has access to this dashboard in our external application. And this is what's very different between Preset and some other solutions embedded is we're not going to rely on cookies or a named user on the back end. We're going to generate a JSON web token that has temporary access to this dashboard and with limited data access that can be used as well. So we can create that one templated dashboard that has access to many different criteria within this data set. In this case, we're looking at some flight data where we have access to all of the different origin airports and all the different airlines here. But when we go to embed this in our application, we're going to generate a guest token that only gives them access to certain origin airports and certain airlines data. And so what this will look like a little more visually, and we can share these slides afterwards as well, is we're going to make a call to this API endpoint. And we're going to reference the team ID and workspace ID provided in that embedded modal. And within the payload, we're going to look at some basic metadata that we're going to pass through. This way we can provide analytics back to you in terms of who's been looking at different dashboards and what type of dashboards they've had access to. We're going to pass through what dashboards they should get access to in this case, and any row-level security parameters that we should apply to them as well. So what that might look like in an actual payload here is if we wanted to embed two dashboards for Grace Hopper, we'd simply pass through the metadata around who this user is, the two dashboards that they should have access to, and then any row-level security clauses that we want to apply to those underlying data sets to make sure that Grace only sees the data that should be relevant to her. any clauses without a data set specified will apply to all of the different data sets that make up these underlying dashboards. But if we are building our dashboards for multiple different data sets, we can very easily specify which data set these row level security clauses should apply to. And then on the front end of our application, what we'll get from that API call is a JSON web token in response, provided it is a valid call. And then we'll just want to reference the preset SDK. So we can do that via a simple script or npm install. But this is where if we're embedding in something like a Notion or a Salesforce, we just need to go into their application builders to be able to reference the preset SDK here. And that SDK will give us access to the embed dashboard function. And again, we're just going to reference some of those parameters from the embedded dashboard modal, where we get the dashboard ID, the domain that it's asking us for here. And then we'll be able to mount the resulting iframe into any specific div or HTML element that can contain it. We'll want to pass forward a valid guest token, and we'll have a couple options in terms of whether or not we want to show the title of the dashboard, show chart controls, etc. So walking through a very simple demo of that, if we get this dashboard to a point where we're ready to embed it in our application, we can go to our home page here, where for this user, we're only going to give them access to one airport's data and for one airline, but we're going to build this off the same dashboard that we have in preset with all those different options. So if we only want our customers to be able to see data coming from JFK Airport for Delta Airlines, we're going to make an API call here for that guest token. And the dashboard that gets rendered in our application is just specific to that data. So while we can make filters available that have the same rich functionality and cross-filtering, et cetera, as well, granted that we've limited what data they can see via that row level security clause, they'll only be interacting with the data that they have access to. And this can be made very dynamic with your application. So if I were to go in here and change my user settings and give them access to many different airports and airlines and go back to that dashboard, they can quickly be given access to more data by quickly re-rendering that with new row level security clauses applied, or they could be given access to additional dashboards as well. In terms of a few more best practices, we do find it helpful to safeguard these away in an isolated workspace. So for those unfamiliar with preset, we make the deployment of multiple superset instances very easy. So you can, in one click, deploy a new workspace. And where we commonly see this used is a separate workspace for an embedded dashboards, where only those who should be able to edit the embedded dashboards and deal with the implementation will have access to them. And that way we can also limit with a specific service account what data sets that workspace would have access to and what other dashboards and users might be in there. Take a look at some of the questions coming in now.
There were a couple of recurring ones. One was, is this possible in Superset? And the answer, basically, yes, there are some nuances between what preset and superset offer that are different. So we'll probably circle back to that question at the end and kind of talk about the delta a little bit there. Somebody was asking if this is done in an iframe, and the answer to that is basically yes, but you are targeting that iframe in the DOM and then using that guest token to provide the actual secured access. Are there any other ones in the Q&A that you'd want to cover now, or should we hold those till the end?
Yeah, in terms of embedding individual charts, right now we do embed entire dashboards. Now, there's nothing stopping you from creating a chart of just one dashboard, or sorry, a dashboard of just one chart. And then that obviously gives you the additional options of styling that chart at the dashboard level, adding additional filters to it. But you would create essentially a one chart dashboard and reference that dashboard ID if you wanted to embed an individual chart. And then for more accurate pricing, you could always reach out to our sales through that link that I believe we dropped in the chat already. If not, we can.
We did.
Yeah. So dropping your name in here, we can reach out about more specific pricing. Since we are not naming users on the back end, it doesn't follow our standard licensing, but happens more in batches. So there is a small platform fee associated with your use case, and then batches of users significantly below the standard $20 a month.
And there was one about modifying the width and height of the iframe after it's rendered in the application. Do you know the ins and outs of that?
There is a get scroll size function that is covered in some of our documentation here.
And that allows you to basically remove the scroll bars and have it kind of auto size the iframe to the dashboard's height, right?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if was modify the width and height of the iframe. Yeah,
I think that's the most common request, is to, if somebody wants to stick a dashboard in there and not have scroll bars on the dashboard, that's the method you would use. But otherwise, if you want to set it to a particular height that does scroll, height or width, then you can just use CSS styling on the iframe itself, I believe.
Mm-hmm. We do have more questions coming in now. So you can customize the filters. As you can see, actually in our embedded, I actually didn't even mean to target these, but we have targeted a little bit of the filters as well. So the filters can be styled with CSS. Additionally, for those of you running the latest version of Superset or on preset, you'll notice that we can switch the orientation of the filters. So if we have, top level navigation or application, we want the dashboard to have filters on the left-hand side, we can support that. And vice versa, if we want to move them to the top of the dashboard so they don't conflict with our app's navigation, that can be accommodated as well. We additionally can always hide those filters. So you could have a dashboard with no filters in there. And cross-filtering will work within the embedded dashboards as well.
Somebody's asking about the size and aspect ratio of the dashboard itself. The dashboards are flexible in layout. They're not really responsive. They don't do, gymnastics of wrapping charts when you're particularly narrow for mobile use cases or anything like that. At least yet. There are discussions about mobile support at some point. But yeah, they're more flexible, squishy in nature than a traditional responsive design per se. That said, actually, the filters are fairly responsive. So those do have a little overflow menu if they're in that horizontal mode like that. So you can see all of the filters, no matter how many you have.
Mm-hmm. And for those chart controls, those aren't meant to be turned off via the configuration options on the preset SDK. Those would be done via CSS. If we wanted to turn filters off, we would do that via CSS now. I believe we recently took that out of the dashboard properties. The chart controls would enable you to turn on or off things like tabs, which we don't happen to have on this dashboard. The chart controls element of that enables the menu to be seen within your application. So I have two different versions of this dashboard within this fictitious application. One with chart controls on and one with them off. If chart controls are enabled, it does allow the user to then export the raw data behind the charts in CSV, Excel, or an image. If those are turned off, as it was with our individual view here, they wouldn't see those menu options. And then the other common option, which we have disabled here, is turning off the title. Turning off the title will prevent everything in this title row here from showing within your application. Now, they wouldn't see the share or edit options here, but they would see the ability to download the whole dashboard as an image or refresh it. But for stylistic purposes, we'll often be hiding the title. Now, in terms of sharing the dashboard, the way Embedded is working here is really meant for you to build in the workflow that makes sense for how you want to share these dashboards. So again, they won't see the share modal when this dashboard is embedded. And then if you do want to enable it for, Microsoft Teams users, et cetera, anywhere that we can reference the guest token and the preset SDK, we could be embedding these dashboards.
Someone's asking about if it can be shared among Microsoft Teams users. If your application is shared among Microsoft Teams users, then effectively, yes. You can build your host application on basically any platform, use whatever technology stack you want. And that, as long as it supports HTML, which presumably it does. So that should be fine. If you're talking about the intricacies of RBAC, then that's a whole different story. If you need to talk about security and synchronizing different user types and user accounts, that's a whole different discussion. But basically, the application should work. There was a question about drilling, and at this point, drilling is not supported by embedded dashboards for a whole host of reasons, but it gets into the intricacies of data security. So, drilling operations allow you to kind of dive deeper into data. And as you can imagine, you might not want people to access more granular data in embedded use cases. So right now that doesn't work, but we're figuring out ways to support that in the future. Comparing this with sharing a dashboard. If you share a dashboard with Preset or Superset, the recipient basically gets the link to the dashboard, and they would need to be granted access to that workspace. So they could just see it on your Superset or Preset instance. And with embedded, the embedded iframe uses a guest token, and essentially anyone that hits that is kind of accessing the iframe embed as that user. So yeah, that essentially allows you to view it without having to have direct access to the Superset instance. Let's see. Do we want to cover a little bit of the difference between Superset and Preset in terms of embedding, or do you have other stuff you want to cover first?
This was all I had to cover for the moment, so certainly can dive into that.
Okay. I know a couple of the differences. One is that if you're using it on Superset, Superset does have an embedded SDK. I can dig up the link and post it in here unless you happen to have it handy, Will. But with Preset, you would actually use Preset's embedded SDK. So it's a different module. Ours is a little bit extended so that it supports multiple workspaces. One of the main features of using Preset is that when you log in, you have the ability to create multiple workspaces, and those are separate instances of Superset. So you can use this feature on any or all of them. And then another difference there is that we have an extra layer of role-based access control that allows you to apply a set of permissions across those workspaces. And that comes into play with Preset's version of embedded as well. There it is. So that's kind of the main delta is around the RBAC permissions and the fact that ours is built to work with multiple superset instances that we call workspaces.
Yep, and that's why we won't go too deep into superset implementation here. Is a lot of what would require some backend configuration on the superset side. We've brought into some preset configurations as well as into the user interface here. So when we do things like generate a new API key, we can do that directly through the UI. And then that works with presets API, which goes one layer beyond the traditional superset API, as we can enable, different teams across different workspaces, different roles across different workspaces, and even manage different dashboards and assets across those workspaces. So this is all covered under presets API documentation, which I will also drop in the chat here along with the Superset SDK that Evan just referenced. But that's part of the reason we're talking a little bit more specifically about preset, at least on the implementation and authentication side, is this will make use of the preset API, which is going beyond Superset there.
There are a couple of questions that are actually about CSS. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a prior blog post about customizing dashboards with CSS. And there's also a similar meetup video that's on YouTube. If anybody needs that link, you can ask us in the Slack channels. But one of them is about legends, which I assume you mean on the charts. And the answer is yes or no, depending on the plugin you're talking about. But somebody's talking about disabling the filters via CSS, and you can do that. So that use case is actually covered by that article. So check that out. Somebody else is talking about customizing the loading logo, and that's not something you can configure on preset yet. You actually currently have to modify the code of Superset to do that. So that is not supported, but if you want to do that on an open source instance of Superset, join the customizing Superset channel on Slack and we'll get into that. Let's see. Can embedding be done only in an iframe or can it be done in a div? To my knowledge, it's all iframe based for the moment. So that's pretty much the long and short of it.
Well, we'll render an iframe in terms of what you would target. We would typically target a div rather than target an iframe itself.
Right, but it's not, yeah, it is going to place an iframe into the DOM of the host application. It's not going to like populate a div with a whole myriad of HTML elements.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes we have people target an iframe within here. In terms of the handlebars charts, yes, that would work. Any chart that's rendering should render the exact same in the embedded functionality.
We're getting a bunch of questions that are not necessarily related to embedding. So we might skip past some of those, but if folks want to get all of those questions answered and we don't have time to do it today, then by all means, reach out to Will if you want to talk about preset specifically, or if you want to talk about open source Superset specifically, then join us on that Slack link, which I can paste one more time for anyone who joined late. And we can take it up in the appropriate channel there. Yeah. But does preset support Trino is one of them, for example? And the answer is yes, we support every type of database that Superset supports and more.
And then for similar questions down at the bottom right now, yes, you can programmatically allow a dashboard to be embedded. That can be done via the API under dashboards here. We also obviously can programmatically apply the row level security both for preset team members using the preset API that is commonly integrated with our SSO providers as well, particularly for role-based access control. But obviously, when we go to create any new guest token, we have that ability to programmatically put in whatever row level security they should be getting access to at that point. So similar to the way that we are doing this dynamically on the fly here to give only limited access, we could build in programmatic ways of deploying these embedded dashboards in a variety of different use cases.
I don't think we answered this one, but somebody's asking if the guest token is specific to an access role or per embedded instance of the chart. And I believe it's the former, that the guest token represents a user and their roles accordingly. So you could use that that user, that role, and that guest token to support multiple dashboards and multiple embedded instances.
Yep. You could ultimately use that guest token across potentially different applications. It would get a little more complex there, as diving into kind of the back end here for those interested in how the sausage gets made. All API requests with the preset API will need a bearer token accompanying them. That expires every 3 hours. Now, the guest token does expire every 5 minutes, but that preset SDK is keeping that refreshed for the browser session. So as long as that session's open, we don't need to be constantly making a new API call. But if we were going to be reloading or we were going to be reusing that token across different applications, we likely would want to create a different guest token specific to that application just to make sure that's being refreshed accurately.
And speaking of refreshing, somebody was asking if auto refreshing the embedded dashboard is also possible. And there's a couple of ways you might approach that. The Superset dashboard itself does have the ability to have auto refresh set on the charts. So you can do that on the Superset side, but you can also in your host application do that as well. Like if you wanted to do a set interval and just refresh your via JavaScript, your embedded iframe as often as you want, you can do that too. You might see more blinky stuff happening with that page reloading if you go that route. Also, maybe that's worth mentioning the caveat that these tokens and access do expire, so you can grab a new guest token effectively as often as you want. You could do that per request if you wanted to go crazy, but you could, there's kind of a happy medium in there somewhere. Ultimately, you don't want people to run into access problems, but so refresh often, but maybe don't go too crazy. I don't know if you have sensible limitations in mind on that, Will, or best practices.
No, with embedded, if I set up this dashboard to auto refresh every minute here, when I load the iframe in the embedded fashion, it's not going to be automatically refreshing as we would see in preset. But as Evan mentioned, if I were to reload this page or to set any reloading on the page, if I wanted to refresh, it would be pulling that latest data based off the dashboard settings.
Cool. Clarifying something about responsiveness, somebody says, is the dashboard not responsive? Are the charts responsive? The answer to both of those is, just to clarify again, is that if, I'm not sure exactly what use case you're going for here. They said they want to embed 2 to 3 charts on the customer page. If you want this to work on mobile, and that's why you're worried about responsiveness, then you might want to just set up your dashboard so that they're kind of laid out vertically to support that. And in a full dashboard, they will take that full width. And when you go narrow, they will squeeze down. And just have 1 chart per row. What it doesn't do is take, say, 3 charts in 1 row and then wrap them downward like so many mobile layouts do. At least it doesn't do that yet.
Yeah. So if I really wanted to make sure that I give the best mobile experience, you could always create a separate dashboard here in the meantime that is just 1 column of different charts. And then depending on the logic you want to build into your application, you obviously could render different versions of the dashboard if you know that person is coming from a mobile device.
Somebody's asking about passing parameters through the iframe to filter results. I think there are a lot of different use cases. They're asking about doing it for a specific user logged into the app. So maybe they see their data or some subset of the data that they might care about. Do you have specifics on that? I know it's possible. I don't know the intricacies of it.
Yeah, I mean, you can continue to use Jinja templating within row level security. Now, it's not going to be pulling in things like URL parameters from outside of the iframe there. So there are just some limitations in terms of how you'd want to reference that. And going back to those initial slides there, the more we can bring this into a thoughtful approach to how we want to structure the data sets over how we're building these dashboards are going to make it much easier then to integrate with any application, regardless of if we're going to pull that from a user data table or an alternative parameter, because that will make it much easier if we do want to reference a URL or anything that we're going to grab a parameter from to ultimately implement into the row level security clause. The more we can get that down to a simple implementation on the dataset side, the easier it's going to be to do more dynamic things on the front end later on.
And someone is asking about if it's possible to share a list of privs for doing things like restricting menu access, or could they get a list of all the privileges? Both the Superset documentation and the preset documentation have a pretty good coverage of this. In fact, the Superset documentation recently had a giant table added to it of all of the RBAC granular permissions. It may or may not be exactly current, but it'll give you a heck of a starting point. If there are any things you specifically want to know about, maybe join that meetup-embedded channel on Slack, and we can kind of help you out on that.
Yeah.
There's a question about SSO. I don't know if you know the particulars of all of our SSO support at Preset, but they're asking if it works with external auth like OpenID, Keycloak, etc.
We can work with any SSO provider that supports SAML and SCIM, SAML for sign-on and then SCIM for user provisioning. And we are looking to expand that, but our most common implementations there are going to be with Okta and Active Directory. But no reason we can't work with other providers, provided they can work with SAML and SCIM. And in terms of, again, presets is going to, come pre-configured with user roles. In terms of the access that the embedded user would have, they essentially are being treated as a dashboard viewer role. So for those that are familiar with the preset users or preset user roles, they would just have restricted read access only. So again, that's part of the reason that they don't have things like drill by access today, where they would potentially be able to see additional data dimensions that they're not necessarily supposed to have access to. In terms of a sample embed, I will drop this link in the chat. This is a more experimental thing that we've come up with recently so that our customers can try out embedded themselves. Now, this is designed not to store your token name or secret from any preset API token created, but obviously this should be done without sensitive data, just to make sure that as we're copying and pasting these, we aren't giving any access to more sensitive data. But if you do want to test out embedded with some non-sensitive use cases, we do have this site set up. One, so we can drop in those parameters and see it embedded within a web page here and how that might look. And this also has some simple examples of the documentation we've walked through here today, as well as some code snippets in Python that you can play around with for a starting point.
There's still a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all, so I'm going to take one more moment to endorse the Slack channel. We definitely will not have time to cover these, but here again is the link to the Superset Slack workspace, which everybody is free to join. And then I'll type the two channel names. One is meetup-embedded, which you can ask questions specifically about this topic here today. And then there's a general, embedded channel that is ongoing for more open source focused questions, where you can get a community answer more likely than not.
So yeah, I know we are running up on time here and looking through a bunch of the questions in terms of, doing things more dynamically with the API. A lot of these are kind of yes, buts, because ultimately there's so much that you want to do all via API versus what you'd want to do in the UI, particularly for making sure that things look correctly for the embedded use case. Because with the preset API documentation, you can see that you would have the ability to largely edit a dashboard all the way through all of its relevant metadata. But ultimately, if we're going to be rendering these in embedded fashion, we'd certainly want to at least make our templated dashboard through the UI first to make sure that we have the look and feel as desired. And then there are lots of powerful use cases we can do with the API in terms of if we'd want to create different versions of that dashboard and dynamically fetch those rather than using row level security. If we wanted to dynamically change things with the dashboard, those are going to be more advanced use cases that certainly we can discuss about accommodating. But again, the more we can keep things simple, particularly for our initial embedded use case, the easier it is for the implementation side, and less room for error we'd obviously find there.
And someone's asking about creating a dashboard where certain charts are visible to certain user roles and not others. Correct me if I'm mistaken, Will, but I think typically the way we would approach this is more at the data access level. So you can restrict data access to particular user roles, and then the charts will respect that. It doesn't really hide and show the chart, so the layout of the dashboard changes or anything fancy like that. But if a chart's data is reduced to the point that there is no data to display by nature of these roles, then it'll just say there's nothing to show here and kind of show you an empty chart.
Yeah, so if I didn't have access to the underlying data set that powered this chart, it would be an empty chart and it would be kind of an empty block within the embedded dashboard. So if we know that for a lot of our users, we are going to be not showing data from that specific data set, that's where we might want to break into two different dashboards and render one for each user. The same row level security might apply, but those with broader data set access would then get that better experience, and those with less data set access wouldn't see the empty dashboard or empty charts on the dashboard.
There are a few questions about pricing here that have kind of different nuances to them, but I think unless you want to dive into the pricing model and how this works, the answer here is follow that link that we pasted earlier. I can dig it up and paste it again in a second, but reach out to Will and he'll give you all the pertinent details. But there are people asking about all sorts of different use cases here, so it may vary a little bit. But we do support small companies, which was one of the questions. So you can actually start using Preset on a free tier if you wanted to just try out Superset on Preset. And then this feature of embedded is priced a little bit custom. It's part of our enterprise plan. So again, talk to Will. He's got all the answers.
Yep. And as I've mentioned, it's best to fill out that form and we can get more accurate pricing to you. We do have everything from small companies that are not even necessarily using Preset on the internal BI side and really using it as an embedded solution for a small amount of customers, all the way up to using this for thousands of different customers for both public facing and internal facing applications. So happy to discuss your use case and what pricing fits in there.
See, somebody's saying that the feature is not enabled in their Superset application. I'm not sure if you're a Preset customer or a Superset user, but you'd have to use the SDK. And if you're a Preset customer, again, talk to Will. If you're using it on open source, then just join the embedded channel and plenty of folks will steer you in the right direction with the open source SDK.
And I saw some mention on downloads there. The downloads would follow, at least with Preset, we default to 100,000 aggregated results that can be downloaded via CSV or Excel format for the individual charts. And then for the whole dashboard, I've disabled showing the title here. But if you wanted to show the title, they would also have the option to download the dashboard as an image. That doesn't do a PDF today, but would give them a PNG file or a JPEG of that specific dashboard.
Another question related to that, somebody was asking about, the max size of the CSV download. If you happen to be an open source user, there is a feature flag to enable full CSV downloads, but that comes with a big fat red flag warning that you can turn that on and you can do it at your own risk, but that can cause some serious server lockup issues and browser issues as well, depending on the size and scale of your data. A couple people have been asking throughout this if they're able to rewatch this later and share it with colleagues and so forth. And the answer is yes, we will be sharing a link by email to everybody that registered, and we'll also drop it in the content share on Superset Slack when that's available, probably later today or tomorrow, depending on how the wind blows and how fast YouTube is. Is there a timeline available for when drilling will be available for embedded dashboards? There's not a timeline at the moment that I'm aware of. I think the answer is until we hear a good proposal on how to make this secure enough to make everyone happy, we're probably just not going to enable it at the moment. But if others are interested in proposing a way that this might work in an acceptable way through configuration and feature flags and things like that, we're open to hearing it, especially in the open source community. And we can get preset people in that conversation too. And, we're happy to discuss it and try to find a way forward. It is on our mind, no doubt about that.
And one question on the tabs and kind of doing those along user level restrictions. While you don't do that in the guest token call, you do have the ability on the front end there to choose what configuration options would be specific to when you're embedding that dashboard. So on the front end, when we're referencing the embed dashboard function, we could very well make this dynamic to the specific user that's logged into your application in terms of if we'd want to enable things like the chart controls or showing the title or the tabs dynamically. And that's similar to what we're doing in this application, where when we click on the admin dashboard, we're actually going to the same dashboard. The only difference really is that we've enabled the chart configuration controls as well, so they can have access to download and see the underlying raw data.
Sorry for the silence. I'm just typing a few answers for quick one-offs. There's a lot of people asking about a lot of specific use cases, things they want to do with embedded and their particular host application with their type of security and their sorts of charts and data and so forth. When you get into these specifics, again, I think Slack might be a more conducive place to discuss this if you're, whether you're a preset customer or an open source user. Let's take it to Slack and we'll try to help you out.
Yep. And again, we wanted to walk through a simple implementation here, both as this is the most common use case we hear of presenting customers data, but also the way that it will be easiest for you to implement. The advantage of particularly preset and superset obviously is the ability to deploy multiple instances. So with preset, that's very easy to do via the API. So we do have customers that do need to isolate their customers into entirely different instances of Superset. And then they are pulling dashboards to embed into their application from multiple different instances. That can all be supported via the preset API. But again, those are best left to a separate discussion, as that will be a little more technical implementation than the standard use case we wanted to cover today.
Someone's asking about hiding tabs in the dashboard. I don't know if you mean all of them entirely, that's just a question of dashboard authorship. So you just don't use the tabs. But if you mean in some dynamic sense, like depending on user or role, I don't think there is such a functionality at the moment.
You can do it on the front end to hide the tabs. It's one of our configuration options. So you can hide a tab as well. That should be covered. Yeah. So hide tab is one option, and that will hide any tabs you would have on the dashboard. This one doesn't have them anyway. So you could do that dynamically on the front end if you wanted to switch it user to user. Otherwise, to Evan's point, we could create different dashboards and dynamically show those different dashboards as well. And so for the question coming in, you likely would need to create different dashboards, as it's not meant to be that granular to just target what individual tabs should be shown or not shown. And then in terms of everything in the dashboard should embed into it. In terms of adding components like a checkbox or something that is coming from outside of preset, we might be getting into some iframe inception material where I don't want to promise that all these things would work, but anything coming through in Markdown that you'd want to reference in your dashboards just for simple text purposes, obviously that will pass through as well.
And there's a lot of kind of RLS based questions. I think that's the same sort of thing where you might want to take your particular question to Slack so we can kind of make sure we're answering you correctly. Whenever security comes up, we want to make sure we're giving you the right answer. It gets a little nuanced depending on your use case. Somebody was asking, how is the guest token generated? If you want to re-ask that question with any particular details you're looking for there, that might be helpful. Otherwise, I don't know, Will, if you want to kind of extrapolate on that a little bit.
It would be going a bit beyond my knowledge in terms of the further sausage making, but in short, we're just making an API call to the guest token endpoint, and we'll get a JSON web token in response that is just getting access to render those specific dashboards and with those specific row level security parameters. So when the preset SDK looks for that guest token, it's essentially going to pass through that as a dashboard viewer with that row level security applied to all the queries that it's going to use to render that dashboard. And we did get an interesting question that has come up recently in terms of hyperlinking. Hyperlinks would work within the embedded application, or yeah. So if I had a link, for instance, in the table here, it would render the link and allow me to link to other resources. Now, it wouldn't dynamically, if we were using this to link to another dashboard, it wouldn't dynamically render that link within the iframe is the only thing to consider. So we would just need to build a cognizant workflow if we are going to link to another dashboard or preset resource in terms of how you'd want that to render into your application by going to an alternative page. But if this was linking to an outside resource like a dynamic Google search or anything like that, yes, that would be able to render in the iframe here.
Going through a lot of the remaining questions here, and they seem a little bit unrelated or a little bit too deep to answer here off the top of our heads without going into some follow-up questions. I'm not sure if any others are jumping out at you as particularly answerable.
Yeah, I mean, for some of the most recent ones that have come in, yes, this will be available for offline viewing. We also have a very short video that we can share. I'll pull up actually that link shortly here that walks through kind of the very basics of this demo in a short 3 to 5 minute clip.
And also there was at one point in history, another meetup that kind of also talked about embedded in a slightly different light, building a Flask application as an example, things like that. So we can share that link as well on Slack, and I'll stick it in the YouTube description for this video when that gets uploaded.
And I just dropped a link to this short video, which is really a demo walking through just implementing the row level security in the demo we walked through today. And then also within the chat here, you do have our embedded demo application where you can play around with this with any preset specific dashboards you want to play around with embedding.
Someone's asking about, is it possible to create charts that users can customize on their own dashboard depending on their role? That would be something better done in Superset. There's not really a chart authoring and editing experience in the embedded offerings. Those are more for consumption than creation and modification. So if you want your users to be fiddling with charts using the chart builder tool formerly known as Explore, then you would want to just give them an account on Superset and let them kind of self-serve on that.
Yep. It is certainly something we're exploring, is bringing more functionality just beyond the dashboard viewers and interactions into embedded functionalities in the future. But in terms of how we'd support that today, you'd want to create a login flow from your application where they could then go into your preset workspace and have further access. And again, the preset API makes that easy to configure the user on the fly if they are not already a user within preset.
Okay, well, we're about out of time, and I think we're about out of the most easily answerable questions. So again, if your question was not answered, and there are many of you that applies to, then please do reach out to Will specifically with questions regarding preset and preset's offering of embedded. And if you have questions about just the general embedding techniques or features that apply to both preset and Superset, please reach out on the meetup-embed channel on Superset Slack, and we can just re-ask these questions, and we'll do our best to answer them there when we have a little more time to follow up. So thank you, Will, for giving us this demo and answering all those questions. It's very much appreciated, and thank you everybody else for joining. We'll follow up, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks all. Bye.